welcome everybody. We are so excited to be with you all today to talk about what you should be taking, transforming, and all of that. But before that, we want to get to know you a little bit. So if you could just go into the chat, you're going to want to make sure that your chat is goes to panelists and attendees so others can see you. So the drop-down menu will give you that option. In the chat, add in what's your favorite innovation. We put a few up here as a reminder or as a fodder for inspiration. But if you have an innovation that you prefer or something new that you maybe you're going to enlighten us and tell us something that we don't know yet, add those in the chat. I'll play a little bit of music as folks join in, but check in so we can. If you could also say your name or add your name and where you're calling in from, that would be wonderful too, just to get a sense of who's in the room.
And Andrea, what is your favorite inspiration while people are adding to the chat?
Ooh, yes. I'm probably gonna go with the AirPods only because recently I lost one of them and realized how important it is to have both. But I think having the ability to move around while I'm talking to somebody has been pretty important. How about you, Courtney?
Obviously, I woke up not that long ago, but my memory foam mattress is really doing it for me, and I appreciate having a good mattress.
Love it. Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks, I agree. The dishwasher, what a good one. GPS.
You're from Minnesota and Wisconsin. Intrigue, Anne. Journaling, Bible, LED light bulbs, yes. I also just saw an article about how we're going to get new batteries. I know nothing about science, but they were saying that this is going to be huge because they're going to be solid, if anybody knows what that means, but it looks like we have a lot of electric cars in our future. Awesome. Digital collaborative calendar, yes. Welcome.
Jody, I see you're from Central New York. My parents live outside of Albany, near Amsterdam, if you're familiar.
Your phone. Yes, Chelsea. Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to introduce ourselves, share a little bit about what we'll be talking about. Please. Hey, Gordy, it's been a bit. Yes, streaming ads. Yeah, we'll share a little bit about what we'll be talking about today and go ahead and get started. But first, we'll introduce ourselves. So my name's Andrea Getchis. I'm an associate partner with Education Elements. You can call me Drea too. I live in the Fort Worth area, but have started my teaching career in Arizona and have moved around a bit. So was previously a teacher, instructional coach, and now in my work, supporting districts around strategy and prioritizing as we're thinking about the upcoming changes that we're going to be experiencing. How about you, Courtney?
Yeah. Morning, everybody. I am a native New Yorker, as you're seeing in this chat, from upstate New York. But I'm in Dallas, Texas. I've been here for a little over a decade. And with Education Elements, I support a lot of our districts, especially our larger districts, think about personalized learning, strategic planning, and how they're moving forward, especially after what's been a pretty wild year. So excited to be here with you today.
Thanks, everyone. So if you're joining, there's a very good chance you know a bit about Education Elements, but if you are new, I just want to share a little bit about us. We are an education consultancy organization, and as you can see here, a big belief that drives us is that schools grow when people grow. And this webinar is probably a good example of that, but we have a series of webinars and different learning opportunities because we really believe that pushing through new ideas, thinking about incorporating innovations from different industries and ideas is all an incredible way for us to make change in our school districts and transform our organization. So a bit about us: we've been around for 10 years. We've supported, thousands of schools and districts. Something that we're really proud of is that middle statistic about how folks come back. It's really speaks more to our relationship building and how much we value the folks that we work with. And then the last thing is that we typically get really good ratings for our content. So hopefully today that's true too, but want to make sure that we're bringing you some new, fresh ideas, some opportunities for you to ask us questions and think, about what's to come. So with that, I'll share a bit about what we'll be talking about today. So what we've been noticing in conversations across the country is that folks are ready to move from reactivity to proactivity. Over the last year, we have been adapting to new regulations. If you think about where we were in May of 2020 compared to where we are now, a lot has changed. A lot of folks have already started moving to in-person. Courtney and I just did a session with about, I don't know, what was that, like 300 leaders in a room. Like, things are starting to open up. And folks are ready to stop reacting to the different changes and really put an idea forth. So something that we've been seeing a lot about, or a lot of interest in strategic planning or strategy in general. So I want to give you all a little bit of an overview of how we think about strategy. And then we want to talk about some of the things you should really be thinking about as we move into this new era post-lockdown, post-pandemic. So a bit about our strategic planning approach. We believe that in the past, or what a traditional strategic plan has us do, is creating something and then investing folks. So this might be where folks are feeling, or the muscle that is easier to use right now, that we want to make a plan, and then we want to get everybody invested, and then we want to execute on the plan. And we like to offer the alternative that we can be creating and investing at the same time. So there is a way to collaborate with your community to think through the different options and priorities that you might have that actually help you in the long run, because you're investing folks as you go and you're creating with them. And so I'm sure that sounds like a lofty and kind of a nuanced idea here. So I'll share a little bit about how we do that. We believe in the idea of responsive planning. So we actually talk about the idea of planning for change and not perfection. So we want to prioritize a process that helps us sustain, adapt, and pivot. And those are like the three big words that we'll use in responsive planning. But we think your plan should be strong, but it should also be prepared to change. So if we feel like we can't say no to an innovation, or we can't try something new because it's not part of the plan, then the plan is probably not strong enough. So we really want to think about planning as something that is made for change and made for adapting. So a few beliefs for you all to see, and like what this looks like in action is we bring perspectives in. We don't just ask for feedback. What we ask for the plan to be developed together. We think about having folks problem solve with us. That increases buy-in and it decreases friction. We also like thinking about planning in short sprints so that we can make the time to pivot or make changes. And then lastly, the communication needs to be clear and constant. So kind of our theory of action on that is that if you do all of those things, your classrooms will become responsive. Students will be getting exactly what they need. Teachers will be able to respond to their students. And leaders and teachers all become a part of these responsive teams that then change the ecosystem across the organization. So if you see on the side, kind of bottom to up, your procedures and systems become sturdy and ready to adapt. Your teams become agile and aligned. That's probably what you've been seeing a lot over this past year, is that folks are ready to change and shift with the pandemic. And your leaders are resilient and innovative. Finally, that means that your classrooms are really catering to the needs of your students. What are their strengths? What are their needs? So today we're going to talk a bit about how COVID has impacted how we think about a lot of those components. So actually pause here and see, Courtney, I know that you've been talking about this a lot recently in strategy. Could you share a little bit about how folks are adapting or some of the things that they're seeing as a result of the pandemic that has, maybe been helpful or has impacted their plan?
Yeah, thanks, Shreya. So, one thing we're seeing as people try and bounce back and bounce forward, if you will, from this pandemic is that some organizations actually did really well during the pandemic. And these are organizations that were set up to be successful. Think about Clorox. They thrived during this time. Amazon, they're able to ship up so much stuff. And they profited. But there are other organizations, and from an economic standpoint, we saw that a lot with small businesses that really struggled to keep up. And there's a big disparity in what that looked like for everyone over the last 18 months or so. The same has been true for education. If you work in a school or a district that already had a learning management system that is already prepared one-on-one, one-to-one for students to do distance and hybrid learning, then perhaps the last year and a half was actually no big deal for you, a chance to really dig deeper into those best practices. But like many of us, that's not where our districts were. That's not where our teachers or our classrooms were. And we saw that teachers actually had a big gap now between what they were used to. And they did a great job trying to address that very quickly without much notice and without a history of doing it before. So all of that led to a lot of feelings for folks, as you all probably know better than us, about what that pandemic felt like as an educator. On top of the global uncertainty, the physical stress of everything, there's also this just knowledge that teachers are feeling burnt out, that they've got a lot on their plates and that they're juggling a lot of things and a lot of responsibilities that perhaps weren't there for them before. As we come back from this, it's not that the last year just goes away over summer vacation. We've seen a growing number of people considering retirement, feeling stressed. And while we really want to lean into that hopeful feeling, we've got to be able to acknowledge the fact that folks have had a tough year and a half for a lot of reasons, and they need our support to move forward.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Courtney. And Courtney talks a bit about being inspired by different organizations that we've seen succeed over the pandemic, and those that have struggled. I know that there are a lot of personal stories that I have in my community where there have been longstanding restaurants or staple businesses that didn't make it through the pandemic, and some that have thrived. So I think there's a lot of us or there's a lot for us to learn from different industries and different examples of what this work has been. And in the previous slide you saw, I mean, things have drastically changed. Like I said, we've been on site in person with folks, and if you all are starting to see people come together, I've noticed a few things. We're not used to the stimulus that we used to have with everybody in person. So reading people's reactions in real time, having music in the background, all of that feels really overwhelming. So as we shift back, it's important that we don't go assuming that this is a summer like any other, that there is really a lot that we need to consider and provide a few frameworks that can help folks identify and communicate the things that they're struggling with and where they want to adapt. So I want to share another piece of inspiration that we got thinking about a post-COVID business plan. Thanks for sharing that source, Courtney. This is an article that speaks a bit about how industries or businesses are thinking about adapting to to the next phase. So I'm going to share about the categories that are shared in this article, and this is kind of the frame for the rest of our conversation. So highly encourage you to think about how this might work or how it doesn't. I think something that we really value at Education Elements is bringing in new ideas and exploring, like, does this have an impact in education? So that's kind of our big question today, and I'm curious to hear in the chat if this is something that speaks to you. So In creating a post-COVID business plan, or we could think about a strategic plan or strategy in general, they talk about 3 different behaviors that you might want to consider. So there are sustained behaviors, the things that you're likely going to go back to from before the pandemic, things that are virtually unchanged, that will remain the same. Transformative behaviors are things that you'll probably return to, but it'll probably have some fundamental changes. So there's some examples here, but I want to share an industry example in a moment. And then finally, there are going to be some behaviors that were completely collapsing, things that probably don't serve a purpose anymore, or things that we might want to adapt as a result of some successes or challenges that we had during the pandemic. So the example that they share in the article that I think it really spoke to me, so I want to share with you all, is actually the experience of 9/11. So in during 9/11, some behaviors really changed. We paused as a country, and that's really the last big, universal experience that we had as a country, and then it also had impacts internationally. So if you think about this, folks stopped traveling. There was a lot of insecurity. There was nervousness about what would happen. There was also a pause. It was not as significant as there was, this past year, but it did teach us a few things. So in the months after 9/11, people were not going to hotels. They were not traveling. So flights were grounded. Folks were not using, hotels, rental cars, all of that. But what they eventually found was folks ended up coming back. So this was something that, while it paused during the after effects of 9/11, it did end up coming back. We built that habit again, and folks started traveling to back to hotels. But travel significantly shifted in other areas. So a transformative behavior, again, travel paused, but eventually folks started coming back. And that was kind of where we started seeing an increase in security. So travel exists, but now we have a TSA checkpoint that is way more intensive. And if you aren't used to it, it is still just as intensive as it was pre-pandemic, but people are continuing to travel. But now we have gotten used to this new behavior, a transformed behavior of expecting to take our electronics out, take our liquids out, and go through security. And then finally, some things that completely changed as a result of the behavior of actually creating those security stop points. You're not allowed to bring liquids from before the boarding areas to after the security system. So actually what completely collapsed after 9/11 was having beverage shops before going into security. So if you'll notice at airports, there are options, but it's not the same as what you can get inside the terminal. So this is a very obviously low risk shift, but a lot of these things, I'm sure we can find equivalents in what we'll anticipate in the coming year. So we might not see those changes yet, but something like this is going to start to emerge. What are those behaviors that we're just going to go back to? What are the things that we do need to shift, or they'll come back with like a different flavor? And then what are the things that are no longer serving us? So with inspiration from this text, from this article, we're going to talk a bit about what we can do to determine how to sustain, transform, and collapse different behaviors. So I'll share a few examples. Courtney might jump in as well. Please feel free to ask any questions, but want to share a bit about how we might think about this.
And we can't see you, unfortunately, so feel free to add into the chat if anything is resonating as well.
Awesome. So in the text, they talk a bit about a few different categories that you might consider looking at. So if we think really broadly about sustained behaviors, we can narrow in a bit further and think about some specific categories within which we can determine what are sustained, transformed, or collapsed behaviors. So there are mechanics. If you want to think through this category, this might be something that you do with your team, are all of the different things that we do mechanically. I named a few, but there might be ways. Please feel free to add to the chat. What are things that we just do because we've always done them? So take attendance, our duties, grading, how we do our meetings. All of those things are probably a habit that we've built over time. So to extend on that, and then Courtney, I'd love to hear from you after I share my example, some behaviors, whether it's in some of our districts or just personally that we've kind of shifted, but we've really stretched the boundaries of attendance over the past year. So now we used to say, are you in your seat? Are you physically here? And now attendance, some folks have been saying, have you completed your work? Are you on Zoom? Are you attending in person? Is there one thing that I expect you to attend in order to do or to be considered as present? So we've really had to be flexible with this. So what might be some of the ways in which we think about attendance in a, in a new era? While I recognize there's a lot of compliance pieces that have to do with attendance, and there's a lot of consideration there, what might be some things that we sustain? So we know we need kids in school. We're not going to say you can't be in school, but what are some ways that we might clarify like being present or being shifting towards engagement? So that might be something that we see transforming. How do we take attendance, or how do we think about attendance? How do we think about engagement? How do we define that? Who kind of extends beyond the classroom to be able to make a determination on that? We've really relied heavily on families, guardians, folks at home that students are with to tell us, this is what they're struggling with, this is what they're really thriving with, or this is how they're feeling. And then are there any things that are going to have to shift, that we're going to have to collapse? I know that personally, I think it's hard to completely let go of some of the habits that we've had before. And it's funny coming back, and I don't know if you all have had this experience, but in some ways it feels like it's been forever since I've been on the road or been in person with people. And in other ways, it feels like nothing has changed. And I found myself going back to old habits that are pretty easy for me to just step into. So, I haven't changed, but the world has. So for instance, in going back to the travel example, a lot of shops have closed down even within the airports. And I'm still going in with 30 minutes before boarding, thinking that it'll be fine. And there's also reduced staff in security. So those are some of the things that we really have to consider, that while we're ready to go back the way things were before, that they've really shifted. I don't know, Courtney, anything you'd like to add? And I know we have a few thoughts in the chat as well.
Yeah, I think for things like grading, something that we've seen some districts do is be mindful of the fact that students have a lot going on. I think when we see them working from their homes, it opens our eyes up to what students' home life and their experience outside of our classroom entails. And so in some districts, we've seen just folks move away from kind of a 0 in their grading policy. And you might be in a district that has already previously moved away from that. But what that can look like is that the lowest grade a student might be able to get is a 50. Some of the rationale for that is that it still lets a student know that he or she has not mastered the concept, but it doesn't put them so low failing that they aren't able to ever come back from it. If you've ever seen a student who's got a grade in a class of a 10 or a 12, the question there is, what is a student going to do with that information? He or she is definitely not mastering the concept, but how do they ever bounce back from a grade that low? And so some things that people might transform coming back from the pandemic that they did differently over the last year and a half is think about what grading means. Is this an opportunity for us to embrace something like standards-based grading or competency-based grading? Is this an opportunity for us to have some real questions about which assignments we grade and why? We can absolutely see grading as a sustained behavior and go back to the way we've always done it. But I imagine that your districts have rethought what grades look like a little bit over the last year to give students more grace. And now I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to either transform or collapse some behaviors that we feel don't really serve students and don't really push them forward academically.
Yeah, thanks for that example, Courtney. I think that's something I'm hearing too, is there's just so much it would be such a big pendulum shift to go from having all of this grace and flexibility to then requiring students to have the same expectations that they did pre-pandemic. So it's really something for us to consider as we navigate this new space that we know none of us are the same as we were before. Another category that they talk about in the article is motivators. So these are some of the things that we are intrinsically or extrinsically motivated by. We have benefits that have shifted over the pandemic. So some of the things that we are motivated to do or have been motivated to do in our work have shifted or have changed. So the transformative and collapse behaviors are things that we really want to consider. What are motivating people? Yeah, and I'm seeing, Ruth, that you're talking about family and balance. This article, and it's linked in the slides, which we'll share afterwards, is talking about return to work anxiety. And I've certainly felt that as well. Being in front of people adds a whole different level of pressure. I think Zoom fatigue means that you're looking at folks online and you're seeing yourself all the time. In person means we're having small talk. We're seeing people that we haven't seen in a long time. We're flexing new muscles, and we're having a lot of anxiety about that. We're thinking about some huge shifts, and some folks have to reconsider childcare. Some people have experienced significant loss. Some people have been sick during this time, and our priorities have shifted, our motivators have shifted. So some things that we're hearing from people are, autonomy in the workplace. Some people have really liked the flexibility of being at home or having flexible spaces within the school or district environment. And being trusted to have that autonomy has been incredibly important for people to innovate. So we've encouraged risk taking, which we'll talk about a bit in the next section. Folks have had flexibility in reducing a commute. They've had flexibility at home to be able to, make their own meal in between courses or classes online. I think balance was probably hard for us to achieve during this time, but I think some things have come into perspective. What does that mean for us? What is the time that I'm spending with my loved ones, and how is that? How do I want the quality of that to be? So as those motivators have shifted, it actually benefits us to think about some ways in which we might adapt our practices. So are there days that or are there ways that we can make schedules more flexible during the day? And I recognize that going, completely virtual or having work from home days might be challenging in a classroom setting, but are there ways that we can have flexibility within the day? Are there ways that we can reconsider scheduling or how we assign class sizes? And I know Courtney and I worked in a district where they made class sizes bigger, but they had two teachers, in a Zoom setting, and they were teaching in different ways. So each of the teachers got a chance to rest, or collaboration was something that was really huge for folks, that they were able to have a colleague and see their work. This is the first time we've actually had the opportunity to be able to observe our colleagues in their work. And that's something that I think has really piqued people's interest. I, as a teacher, definitely worked very siloed, and we were all working in parallel, working in the same ways. I had, ideas or rumors about who had really strong practices, but I was never really able to see it unless somebody was covering my class. So what are we thinking about in those ways that we can motivate people to feel that connection, that balance, that flexibility? What can we do? What creative ideas do we have to lean on those motivators? Yeah, and I'm seeing some thoughts here, Ruth. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Courtney. But yeah,
this is one that really resonates with me. Drea knows this, but I had a baby during the pandemic, and so all of the time at home has really shifted how I think about what I do with my time now coming back from it. And so one of the things that I've really enjoyed is getting my groceries delivered. And I don't know why I didn't do it before, but that has completely collapsed my behavior of going to the grocery store. If you've ever tried to do it with an infant, it's not fun, and it's much easier to just get things delivered. I think really when we think about the motivators, we should consider what's motivating us, but also what's motivating the rest of our stakeholders. What's important to the families that we work with, what's important to the students we work with. And something that we've heard about is really just the flexibility. So I was on a call with one district, and We had done some community engagement via Zoom. And while at first they were hesitant, what they found was actually a lot of folks who weren't normally able to join were able to log in because they could join while they were driving, they could join while they were still at work. It didn't take away from their ability to connect with their student and what's going on with the school. And so in that way, maybe that's a transformed behavior. Maybe you think about doing PTA meetings in a hybrid setting where folks have the option to join virtually if that makes sense for them. I also think when you think about motivators, thinking through with some empathy, what's motivating your students. One of the benefits of having so much instruction done virtually is that students can come back and rewatch things as often as they need. And so at Education Elements, we really believe in personalizing the learning experience. You can find lots of information about that on our website. But one of the things that's important is giving students some flexibility and autonomy in how they learn. And so if a student has access to rewatch a mini lesson and can go back and see what their teacher was talking about, or give themselves a second chance at learning that information, we think that that's really driving some of what's resonating for students about this time. And it's a behavior that teachers could potentially continue to do as we move back to a face-to-face setting.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Courtney, because I think that's true. I've seen teachers trying new tools, something that even I can speak internally to what we've done at Education Elements. Video Ask is a tool that we probably wouldn't have used prior to this. We use it all the time now. So it's a way that you can have a video conversation with folks asynchronously. I can send a message, you can reply. We feel that connection, but it's a new tool that we're thinking about. And I love that. There are just so many different tools that people are incorporating that are probably here to stay. Donna, it seems like you had a similar experience that stakeholder meetings or parent meetings, guardian meetings are something that folks are wanting to do virtually. That's actually a shift that we're seeing too, that we might start adapting to is why don't we do a lot of these meetings virtually so that we can offer flexible times. And that really speaks to our commitment to equity. We want to make sure that everybody has access to this work. And we've actually seen some ways in which we have been really intentional about that. Yeah, and I'm seeing a few other comments here, Dr. Jan, that folks have been increasing their PTO. We hope to continue using Zoom to draw our parents in. Absolutely. I think people are taking time off right now because they need the break, and we need to be flexible with that. We're even considering how we schedule internal meetings. How do we allow for some flexibility? So maybe we do meet virtually, so that folks have the option to either, meet from a different location or get it afterwards after it's been recorded. Yep, interviewing on Zoom. Those might be here to stay. Yep. Awesome. Thanks everybody for sharing. Last one is pressures. So I know this might be a bit controversial to add in here, but I wanted to speak to other big shifts that we've seen in education and how those impact what we can learn from that. So there are different pressures at different times that we consider when making our decisions. So there's some behaviors that we take on because of the pressures that either exist in social forces within our organizations, things that we've created ourselves. And it's a great time right now for us to consider what those pressures have been, and then what are shifting the pressures to move back to the behaviors that we've had before. So if you see the sustained behaviors, what are those social forces that have pushed us to continue to move in a certain direction or work in a certain habit or style of work? Some of the things we might consider for transformed behaviors are folks getting mixed messages about things that they've shifted. So maybe there's some things that we're kind of moving back to, but there's a lot of question about why don't we do what we were doing over the past year? This was really working. Could we consider this? And then are there deterrents or other social pressures that are new? Like some of them might feel very familiar, which is the example I want to share in a moment. But some of them might feel different. We have a lot of different pressures moving into this new year as we're becoming committed to the experience of all of our students, making sure that all students feel belonging, that we are actively combating issues of overt and covert racism, and thinking about the extreme loss that a lot of our students and families and our staff have experienced. So something that we've learned over the pandemic, I think, is that we are incredibly resilient and we are adaptive to risk taking. I can name many different examples in which folks have just had to take the risk because this was just the conditions that we've been in over the past year. So people have been, trying new tools, using Zoom, grouping students, all of those things just came out of necessity. Those were the pressures that were motivating us. We also know that there are other social pressures that lead us to create some systems that have made us risk averse. So not to go into, beliefs around this, but we do know that No Child Left Behind added a lot of focus on testing. So we added all of this pressure to make sure that something that was well intended to make sure that students were able to access their education also had a new pressure or effect on us because of the accountability that came along with it. And so something for us to consider as we're going into this new era where funding is, we are getting funding for recovery for students. What are we thinking about to make sure that we're still taking on those risks that we wanted to take on before? What are some of the things that we can take on, the calculated risks, the things that are safe enough to try, is we want to make sure that we don't fall into the pressure of being risk averse during this time.
Um, Yeah, I added this to the chat. Definitely a lower stakes example than some of the ones you've just brought up. But I do know that Andrea bought a house during COVID, and it was one that her husband had never seen because he was unable to travel and they were relocating. And so that's the kind of risk that we normally wouldn't take. I don't think you would normally do that, Andrea. But COVID has shifted the way that we think about things. I'm going to add one into the chat. As I said, I'm in the Dallas area, but you know, to your point about thinking differently about race in education, Dallas ISD has just recently announced that they are banning suspensions because we know that they disproportionately target our students of color. And so as they work to think differently about what it looks like to be in the classroom, they're getting rid of suspensions and replacing them with things like more restorative practices. This is a big risk, it feels, especially for some very large campuses that have maybe used this as a last effort when they need help with classroom behavior. But I think it's an example that a large district taking a pretty big risk and thinking differently about how we support all of our students. We've got a little bit of conversation in the chat, and this is where we really wish we could have some more dialogue with you, because you're right, you're bringing up things around kindness, gun violence, safety, and thinking through how do you respond to those pressures in your community. Joy is going to share a little bit about one of the ways that we help engage folks and really go deeper into what does this look like in your organization. So take those issues that are top of mind for you and think about how what you do next can really dig deeper into uncovering how do you move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. So this is, if you've worked with us before, you've probably heard about this practice of a retrospective, and it really is just a reflection, but something that we think about that I think could uncover a lot of the questions that you might have about what you want to sustain, what do you want to transform and collapse. This is just another way of thinking about it, but building some time with your team to reflect and discuss what went well, and what didn't, so that we can constantly improve and think about the ways that we want to pivot. And I think this goes without saying, but I cannot tell you how many times, I mean, I've already been in person with 3 different districts in different cities, and it really is like we're moving ahead. So we're putting this year behind us and we want to move forward, and we want to make sure that, we're having our administrative retreats together, and we just want to focus on the year that's upcoming. And that is completely, I think it speaks to the resilience that we have within our education community. And I would highly encourage you to build in time to reflect with your team. Like I said, a few things that I'm noticing is like folks are overstimulated in sessions. Afternoons is a really tough time to learn new skills. Like we're really tired. So to just push forward and hope that this that things transform and change is not going to happen. We have to be really intentional about the ways in which we build in time to reflect with our teams and think about, what are we nervous about leaving behind? What are the things that we hope we learn and take forward? And I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to think about this organizationally and very broadly, but I think just starting within our teams and saying, what do we want to do ourselves? What are some of our nerves and anxiety about coming back? And what are we hoping we're bringing with us? What are some of the things that we want to collapse and transform? And if you need more proof that this is the thing to do, I want to share this article as well that you'll see once you have the access to the slides. Is talking about failure is crucial to growth. And I know failure, we're in education, we don't like the idea of failure. Like we like it in conception, but not necessarily in reality. And I do think that being able to talk about unwanted outcomes or even some of the great things that happened can give us space to continue to innovate. It helps us do, these are some of the things that I think we've noticed in retrospectives and being able to talk about what has and has not worked is it's helped us frame challenges into questions and hypotheses. So it helps us think about how might we consider doing this differently? How might we bounce back from this rather than like dissecting the fact that it didn't work? So it's really a shift in how we think about moving forward rather than just staying in the past and assigning blame and trying to make sense of it. Discussing something prevents replication. So once we talk about it and we've named all of the different things that contributed to some of the challenges that we faced, we're less likely to do it. We've all talked about it. We kind of agree that it didn't work. So it's an important piece as well, just to make sure that we're being conscious of the things that we don't want to recreate. And like I said before, it reduces blame, it increases learning. If we pose all of these challenges as learning problems or something that we could potentially solve together, it's way more motivating to think about like, how might we do this together? How might we open up the different opportunities for us to add our voices, add our experiences to learn from this and move forward. Courtney, anything you'd add about retrospectives that you've led or you've heard people talk about?
Yeah, this idea that complexity reduces that blame. We know that people are less afraid and less maybe nervous about talking about things that didn't work well when we recognize that it was a really complex problem. So we have an opportunity here to say how we responded to COVID, that was a complex issue. There are lots of ways that we can talk about it. Meals, transportation, social emotional supports for students, special education, English as a second language support, and then our regular RTI Tier 1 instruction. All of that was at play with COVID, as well as other things outside of the classroom. And so when we talk about what worked and didn't work here, people aren't going to feel as much blame because they know this was a really big issue. But oftentimes when we come into someone's class and we don't always give them that feedback, we all know that teachers can sometimes feel a little bit taken aback by unsolicited feedback. And so something that we think is important with these retrospectives is do them often. The more that you do them, the less pressure they feel and the more comfortable it is to really talk about how to grow. At Education Elements, sometimes people will put on your calendar, can we have a retrospective about this? And it sends this immediate feeling of like, oh no, what did I do wrong? If those things are scheduled in advance and we know that, hey, this is just when we normally step back and reflect, then it's part of our practice and part of the way we learn and grow together. And so we encourage you to kind of keep that same mindset when you approach it with your teams. What is your scheduled time for reflection? Don't just make it this summer as we bounce back and bounce forward from a big event. Put it on a calendar for maybe halfway through each grading period so that your teams have the opportunity to regularly reflect and grow.
Yeah, I love that, Courtney. I think that folks that you schedule the time to reflect, it's the easiest thing to deprioritize, but could also be the biggest thing that could impact you moving forward and making your work more efficient, effective, sustainable, all of that. So the benefit of, ooh, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties over here. But I think that as the slides come back up, something that I think is interesting for us to think about is what is, we have this opportunity with ESSER funds to think about how we're, once we reflect and once we decide to move forward on a few different things, we have funds now. We have an opportunity for those things to align. So we wanted to draw your attention to our ESSER guide. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. We all do that from time to time. That's another thing that I think has changed in the pandemic, is that people have a ton more grace with folks in the virtual space. I hope that's something that doesn't change. I appreciate it. But yeah, we have a guide on ESSER funding and planning, things that you might consider. So out of these retrospectives, out of these different reflections that you have about the behaviors that you might adapt or change, we have some guidance and some ideas for how you might adjust your funding to align with those priorities that you're thinking about. So that's also, I think, why people are taking advantage of this time to do strategic planning, thinking about moving forward in very systemic ways that give us some focus areas, give us some systems that we want to address. That's something that we definitely see. There's a pressure to submit everything that you need in order to get that funding, and also there's some opportunities for us to really think, pause, reflect, and align our funding to that. So just to draw your attention to a few different things on this resource, there's, a few different places where you might focus your attention based on what you need. If you are not familiar with ESSER funding, you can start with that first bullet point. What is it? We do a little bit of explaining of that. There is, you might be thinking about developing your ESSER plan and incorporating folks' feedback from what they want in order to see that funding align with what your community needs. So you might focus in that section 2. 3, you have priorities that you're thinking about that you want to align your ESSER funding to. So if you already have goals and you're thinking about a system-wide approach that you're already prioritizing, we have some tips on that and how you might think about your funding. And then the last is, if you're understanding what ESSER is, you understand your priorities, and you want to make sure that you're implementing it well, this last piece around sample approaches and plans and how other folks are thinking about it is also important. So just wanted to add that in there, that we do have this opportunity, or you all do have this opportunity to not just reconsider and reflect and think about it in theory, but this is the time to leverage the funding that we have to support our students in this, our students, our staff, everyone in this recovery period that we have. So with that, I'm going to move us to Q&A to see if there are any questions from the group. We might be able to give you a few minutes back, but would love to hear any other comments or questions that you have after hearing from us. So there are 2 ways you can do this. You can put this in the chat and share with all panelists and attendees, or you can use our Q&A tool that will be able to read it and then read aloud. But while you're adding questions, Courtney, I have a question for you. If you're thinking about some of the things that you hope that we transform or that we keep from something that you learned over the pandemic, what would that be? Or what is something that you hope we transform or adapt?
Well, as you know, prior to coming to Education Elements, I co-founded a personalized learning high school. And one of the things we wanted to think differently about was what's the student high school experience? Specifically, how do we set students up for success after they leave the K-12 system? And we thought one of the things that would be most impactful in that is the ability to have internships and to go actually try out the different career paths that they might soon be paying a lot of money for a college education to prepare them for. And given the rising cost of college and post-secondary education, we know that figuring out what it is you want to do ahead of time is important. So this is a long-winded way of saying that one of the barriers we ran into with giving students the time in the school day to go to an internship was, how do they still access their coursework, and how do we take attendance? And I think that COVID has pushed us to think differently about what it means to be present in class and how students can learn. And so for me, I just see so many possibilities to open up the door and think differently about what students do during the day and what they can maybe tackle at home or on a flexible schedule. What about you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. Part of something that I hear in a lot of the work that I do with teachers, and even some of what I experienced myself, is it's hard to teaching education is a really hard job, and it's it takes a lot out of you. And I think that some flexibility, I wish for flexibility for our folks in education to have more time to collaborate with peers, to learn from one another, to lean on one another and build community. So I hope that that's something that we take into the future, is building flexibility, but not just so that we can, you know, wear sweatpants from home on a teacher work day, but is it, I mean, even though no judgment, because that's totally something I would want to do. But how are we thinking about building in flexibility so we do have that sense of community and that we can lean on one another? Awesome. It looks like I'm curious if there is a collection of responses on the subject from districts. That's a great question, Erin. I think some of what we have in the ESSER funding is like some plans that people have incorporated, or how they're aligning their funding to some of the new ideas that they have. I can just share anecdotally some things that I've heard, but we don't have like a collection of these. We've noticed that folks are innovating around new opportunities in education. So one district, sorry, that's very broad, but one district that I'm working with has started incorporating a career academies. So this was something that they had wanted to do before, but now this is the perfect opportunity for them to take it on as an organization. So they're actually thinking about, how do we incorporate the community, the industries that impact our community, the interests of our students, and how do we create a set of courses that help our students have experience within a industry. So not just including in internships, but also doing research about their occupation of choice, doing some work with community members around some problems that they have within their own community. That's all been facilitated through this time. So that's one thing. The other thing I've noticed is innovations around parent or family academies. So thinking about ways that we can reach out to families to teach them how to support students at home. Those have now gone virtual. So there are a lot of things that we're seeing folks just adapt as well. Yeah, thanks, Dawn. I agree. There's a limited career path, so flexibility could really help with motivators. Yeah, and if you're looking for more resources on that, that's something that we think about in our teacher retention work, is our employee value proposition, and how we really get flexibility is something that folks value generally, especially those coming out of college now. Flexibility is kind of the name of the game. So how are we competing with other industries as well? Let's see. I know we have a question. Courtney, can you read the question in the Q&A? I'm not able to access it.
More some comments here just around, how do we keep the kindness and the grace that people showed one another going into next year. And then also just thinking, love to see a deep dive into some of the out of the box type ideas, such as having hybrid offerings all the time, reducing the need for rebuilding or building new schools through the same type of instruction. Thinking about kind of, how do you bring in that like Google Workplace where kids would have time there and time at home. So it sounds like people have lots of great ideas for what they would like to see for the future, and thinking through what that might look like.
Yeah, and stay tuned. We have a few things coming up. We'll share our upcoming schedule with future webinars and events. where we will be thinking about, how are we innovating? How are we taking that pause? So stay tuned. We'll add that into the follow-up email so you can see the other opportunities that we'll build in for folks to collaborate with one another. So with that, I think we're going to end this time. Thank you all so much for being so engaged. We really appreciate your attendance, everything you've done over the past year. We know that it has not been easy. So thank you. Thank you for being here, for taking this time. We know your time is valuable. So we hope that you've learned something. Please expect to see the slides from today and any future opportunities. We'd love to see you again. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.